coming today. And as I said, let's start talking about science and DoD. First of all, how is it done? All right, and when you talk about how is it done, you really need to talk about, well, what do you mean by science? And then also you need to think about, how do you support it? What does in this case, what does DoD do with respect to science? So, first of all, you need to talk about what is scientific research, right? And many of you may be familiar or may have seen this before, past year's quadrant, where, for example, you have in this axis just an increase in knowledge, if you will, with respect to research. And this is research for the sake of knowledge, research for the sake of an application. And in many cases, we live here. We live in the pure applied research, Edisonian, if you will, or the past year's quadrant where it's use-inspired. Very little, if any, of our work is really basic research, pure basic research. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So, science, how do you define it? Well, you can go to the dictionary, right, and grab a definition. Keywords here are observation and experiment. Basic research. What do you do in basic research? In many cases, you publish. That's your product of basic research. Applied research. You may publish, but you also may patent. You start to think about applications at that point a little bit more than you did in basic research. And then advanced technology. You, in that case, are probably thinking more about patenting rather than just publishing your work. So, with respect to science and what DoD does, DoD has different categories in which they support research. And the first one's called Budget Activity 1. Budget Activity 1 is for basic research. And again, the product there is to publish. And in fact, if you're doing Budget Activity 1 type of work in DoD, you're allowed to publish. You don't even have to get permission. You're allowed to publish whatever you work on. The next one is Budget Activity 2, and that gets a little bit more stringent. And we'll talk about the agencies that are behind this as well. But there, for example, you may end up publishing or you may end up patenting. And then finally, Budget Activity 3, where you're probably thinking more of an application. You're really getting into the technology side of things now, okay? So, basically, what is it? Science is literature, right? Because if you're not getting the information out there in a publication or a patent at this portion of what we call science, you're really not completing the job. It really has to get out there. And so science is literature, so we'll keep that in mind. That's one theme here. The other is okay, what agencies actually support science? This goes back many years. You can see the Office of Naval Research, or ONR, back in 1946 was established. And then the Air Force, the Army, DARPA, and then finally DTRA, or the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, in '98. The interesting thing here is that all of these agencies have, except DTRA, has the word research in their title. So they think about research. They think about supporting science. Actually, the definition that DTRA uses has basic science research in their objective. So all of these agencies are the ones that really concentrate on funding science for DoD. There are other agencies, there are other organizations, of course, that support what they would say is science. But again, if we're thinking from a category of a Budget Activity 1, basic science, applied science, Budget Activity 2, these are the main agencies. These are the ones that really support most of the work that goes on in DoD. So, how does that stack up with other agencies? Well, first of all, you need to take a look at, again, this is just the basic and applied research, all right? This is not going further than that. And by looking at the other agencies, you can see, by far, NIH dominates, right? NIH spends way more money than in the federal government than most of the other agencies, or than any of the other agencies. And in this case, you can see where the Department of Defense sits. It's in the purple area here. And it actually hasn't changed much over the years. If you look at this data here, you can see that the Department of Energy has maybe a little bit of a fluctuation, but not too much. So you take that, you think about that, and you think about, okay, they have a piece of the pie. How does the pie look like? What does it actually look like for DoD, though? So you can look at these dollars, and in this case, this is going from a budget year of 95 up to, well, here it says 18, okay? But it's even beyond that, if you will. And I want you to just focus on, again, BA1 and BA2, the green and the blue that is here. BA3 is the red. There's a little fluctuation there. But what you notice is that it's remarkably flat over this relatively long period of time. And this is in constant FY14 dollars. So what does that say? That to me, that says that you may hear, oh, we're worried about our science being funded. Well, from a basic and applied research, it really hasn't changed much. There's plenty of funding there, and it has stayed pretty constant over the years, and it looks like it's going to continue out over the next 8 to 20 years that way. It's fairly flat. Again, it's a small piece of the pie, so that's one thing to keep in mind, but it is very flat and very constant. Now, where you will see some big changes, of course, are in these other areas, these budget activities 4, 5, and 7, and so on, which get much closer to applications, much closer to the actual platforms. There's where you're going to have big changes and big developments. Okay, so coming back to what we have here now, again, science is literature. It's important to put in perspective what I mean when I say science. In this case, I'm talking about the budget activities that are toward the left, if you will, basic science and applied science, so 1 and 2. And so let's keep that in mind as we go into, well, how, for example, how might a place like IDA actually help support science as well? All right, who are the performers of science in DoD? Well, very obvious, universities, a very big performer. They get a very nice piece of the pie here, if you will. There are DoD labs. There are many DoD labs. I think the number was in the 60s last time I saw it, that perform, again, basic and applied research. There are, of course, industry. Much of industry does get some work to do in what you would call basic and applied research from DoD. And then there's FFRDCs, which we all know what FFRDCs are, right? Because we work for one. So what do? Well, universities usually get grants. And the nice thing about a grant is that they don't really have to do anything after they get the grant except publish. And that's what they do. They'll publish it. They own the work. They can actually deviate a bit from what they really wanted to do in the first place. They have a lot of flexibility with a grant. That's why Budget Activity 1 is often used to support universities and grants. Once you move to industry or even some parts of universities and you start doing more applied research, in applied research, you often have contracts. When you have a contract now, you have milestones and you have things you have to meet. Your contract can be cut, you can lose funding, so on. It's a lot different than a grant. And so consequently, you'll see an organization like DARPA, for example, they'll do a lot of contracts because they'll hold people to milestones, and if you don't meet your milestone, you may not have the contract next year. And so consequently, it's a different type of vehicle, and it's often used that way to sort of move the technology or move the science along, if you will, right? And then you have multi-university research initiatives. They're very large grants. There are often many universities that band together, many investigators that come together, and they work on sort of a themed problem, if you will, photonics, all right? Nanomaterials. I mean, it's very themed in that way. And there's a fair amount of competition for this, and DoD funds a fair amount of MURIs, or MURIs is what they're called, in this respect here. Then you have project funds at DoD laboratories. Now, DoD labs, for the most part, the ones that you may or may not be familiar with have a very small pot usually that deals with budget activity 1 and 2. There's only certain labs that get maybe a little bit more of that funding than others. But for the most part, you're talking about relatively small numbers compared to the overall pot that the overall budget that the laboratory might have. And that is because, the laboratories work for the services, right? And so they have problems they have to work on. They have to deal with maybe things that are not necessarily research in nature. They might have a problem that they need to fix and, that has to go, maybe in the next few months or so on a vehicle or on a platform. So they need to be thinking about those things, and they don't necessarily are thinking that far out. But nevertheless, there is, again, budget activity 1 and 2, basic and applied research at the laboratories. And then finally, the product in many cases, as I said, is a publication. And that's true for any of these organizations. It can be a publication from industry. It can be a publication from the lab, again, depending on the type of money it is. And it could be a patent. Actually, the DoD labs try to make it incentivize the actual patent process by giving the inventor money back on the patent. If they file a patent, they get a few $100s. If the patent gets licensed, they get a percentage of what comes back from the license, and so on. And so they really try to move the things along with respect to that. And then finally, you have people that actually win Nobel Prizes at some of these institutions. And if you go to any of the websites, the Navy, the Army, and the Air Force, you'll see they highlight these very prominently because, you know, we've sponsored work by. And of course, if the Nobel Prize winner is somebody they've sponsored work by, they kind of take credit for that person. So, and then finally, just in general scientific recognition, which we all want, right? So, okay, so